So DealQuest listeners, I am so excited to have Dave DeVoe back on the DealQuest podcast. For those of you who have been following us from episode 1, I know there's some of you, although our listenership is growing, so many of you weren't around back then, but you can always go back. You go back and listen. Dave DeVoe was our first guest on what was then Fueling Deals. He is now episode 91. So 90 episodes later. And Dave, I know we're going to talk about some things that have happened in the last 20 months. What are some of the themes that people are going to hear about on your latest episode of DealQuest?
Yeah, man alive. Corey, you covered a lot of ground. You covered it quickly. I think we went back everything from the life cycle of M&A over the last even couple of decades we touched on. More specifically, the last 20 months or so, including COVID, which has been a crazy roller coaster. We got into valuation. We got into deal structure. We even got into some interesting philosophical discussions along the way. So covered a lot of rich ground indeed.
I love it. And listen, folks, as Dave always does, he gave some amazing trends and statistics in terms of what's happened, what he sees coming in the future, and also, Dave's firm has expanded in terms of capacity and people and services. And, you get to hear a little bit more about that because DeVoe Company is doing some cool things. They were always doing some cool things, but doing some more cool things that they weren't doing a couple of years ago. So check out Dave DeVoe coming up on the DealQuest podcast. Do you want your business to grow faster? Are you open to new and out-of-the-box ways to drive revenues and increase value? How do you imagine the most successful entrepreneurs and business leaders double, triple, or expand their businesses tenfold or more? The answer is Deals. This is a weekly podcast featuring conversations with business owners, executives, and leaders as we reveal behind-the-scenes details that give you, our listeners, the confidence to pursue your own deal-driven growth. On the show, we discuss a huge variety of deals, everything from large, complex mergers and acquisitions to smaller deals that you can do even without significant capital. My name is Corey Kupfer, and I've been supporting deal-driven growth for businesses for 35 years as a successful entrepreneur, professional negotiator, and attorney. My goal is to help you strategize, plan for, find, and complete deals that will help your company grow faster. Welcome to the DealQuest podcast. Let's get started. David DeVoe founded DeVoe Company in 2011 to help wealth management companies optimize their business decisions. The company has supported over 500 firms in consulting, investment banking, and valuation engagements since launch. David has been a thought leader on RIA practice management for over 17 years and was recently named RIA M&A Guru by Barron's magazine. I've known that Dave's an RIA M&A Guru, but but Barron's carries a little more weight than my knowledge, I think. Sure. That's pretty cool. He previously served as the managing director of strategic business development at Charles Schwab Advisor Services. In that role, he developed and led Schwab's transition planning platform, which provides comprehensive M&A and succession planning services to registered investment advisors. During that 8-year period, he provided strategic counsel to over 300 advisors. I'm not going to read his entire bio. It's going to be in the show notes. But, before joining Schwab, he was at American Express, at the Strategy and Business Development Group. He's a Berkeley and Cornell graduate. And here's the interesting part. Dave DeVoe is the first person that I'm having back on for a repeat interview on what is now the DealQuest podcast. And believe it or not, folks, for those of you who didn't catch on to this at the very beginning, Dave DeVoe was the very first episode of what was then called the Fueling Deals podcast, launched on February 20th, 2019, 20 months ago, the day after my birthday. That's when we launched it. And this episode is going to air on October 21st, and it's going to be episode 91. So we've had 90, or I guess 89 episodes between his first appearance and this one. So I'd love to welcome back to what is now the DealQuest podcast, David DeVoe. Great to have you back.
Wow, it's an honor to be here. Honor to hear those great accolades. Clearly a pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Corey. And congratulations. I mean, what a great achievement you have here. 90 and counting podcasts, really helping people that need to learn more about negotiation and getting things done. I think it's wonderful. So I'm happy to be back. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Dave. It's interesting. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but when I found out there was a thing called pod fade, the majority of podcasts don't make it past 15 episodes. I'm sort of a do it or not do it guy. Like I'm going to do 0 episodes or hundreds of episodes, not 14 or 12. So
yeah, indeed.
So we're well along the way, which is great. And listen, folks, I wanted to have David back. I mean, when we first started the podcast, I recorded 8 episodes, put them in the can because that was the advice to get ahead. And then we chose to launch Dave's as number one because when you're doing a deal podcast, a lot of people think about M&A and that kind of stuff. And although the podcast is specifically about all types of deals, from big M&A and financing deals to licensing and joint ventures and strategic alliance, we figured who's better to start than a top investment banker and consultant and valuation person in the M&A space. And also, although it's not the only area we work in, the RIA space, the investment advisor space, is our biggest single niche, and Dave focuses in that space. So it really made sense. So what we want to do on this episode, and I'm going to a question preceding this, but a lot has happened in the last 20 months. So I want to get an update from Dave on what's going on in the space. But Dave, before we did that, listeners, if you go back to that first episode, you can hear some great stories about Dave's first entrepreneurial ventures while he was in college. But Dave, my opening question on this new format, or it has been for a while, is actually not what your first entrepreneurial experience is, but what is your first deal of any type that you can remember?
Yeah, let's see. Well, it's interesting that first company you allude to, my little clothing company that I started while I was in college. It's probably my first deal I should have done. I mean, I had these relationships with Nordstrom's and surf shops and manufacturing. And I think it's heartbreaking because I was just like, I didn't know much about business. I was like, okay, I guess I'll go do something differently. And I didn't sell the firm, which, in retrospect was just a poor decision. But I'll answer your question in terms of first deal within the RIA space. Clearly, I did a couple deals when I was at American Express as well. But the first deal, interestingly, well, I'll talk about the second one. The first deal that we did, it's so neat. As soon as we finish this podcast, I'm actually meeting with a client, and one of the folks on their team, chief strategy officer now, was the first connection that I made running Schwab's M&A platform. So that was number one. And then number two, it's really interesting. I just had a reporter call me because it was announced that EP Wealth took on some private equity. And the second deal that I worked on, again, this is 17 years ago, I think 16, 17 years ago when I had launched and was running Schwab's M&A platform, were the guys at EP Wealth that were buying this little RIA back in the day. And, they're probably 20, maybe even 30 times the size of the company that they bought so long ago. So, yeah, it's great to see progress. It's great to see people that you like and admire, and we're happy to help way back when, now doing these great things in today.
I love it. I love it. You and I have something in common because I have the story about my flyer delivery business, delivering circulars in Brooklyn door to door when I was 15 and 16. And I made the same mistake you did. I mean, I was making a few $100 a week in the 70s as a 15-year-old kid, making $300 a week. And yeah, I had no concept of enterprise value, which is something that, we always preach to advisors who are leaving, wirehouses and, banks and trust companies to become independent to be able to build enterprise value. Well, I similarly had no concept that I had contracts and, and stuff like that. When I went away to college, I just gave up the business. And you're right. Yeah. I mean, I could have sold that to one of my friends, at least, who could have taken it over. I mean, that was a $300 a week cash flow.
Absolutely. There's some value there. Absolutely.
For a 15-year-old kid.
Yeah, 100%.
So, all right, Dave. So listen, it's hard for me to think back to 20 months ago when, you were on the show originally, and people can go back to that episode. It would be actually a cool thing. People go back and check out that episode. By the way, there were also a couple episodes that I did out of, Dave runs this great M&A summit every year. This year, it's going to be virtual coming up, but normal times it's in person. And, last year's summit, I did actually a couple episodes, talking about all the wisdom that came out of that. So you can check out those as well. I don't have the episode numbers handy. But Dave, so a lot, it's even hard to think back to 20 months ago. It feels like it was another universe. I mean, so much has happened in the world, in general. So much has happened in the RIA space in terms of deals that have been done, in terms of the impact of, of COVID. So just, catch us up on what are you seeing now? What's evolved over those last 20 months?
Yeah. It's clearly been quite a journey, even a little roller coaster in there. But I think 20 months is a good period. It's not just back to when COVID started. Let's go a little further back. So, 2019 was a really good year for RIA M&A activity. Kind of a weird thing to say, a good year for it. One, I think it was a 6th successive record year of M&A activity. So M&A was hot. But, what I'm talking about is actually healthy M&A. And when I look back at 2019, I feel like it was healthy because we had steep growth. It was about a 30% increase above the year before. So significant, not a massive spike, but, strong, steady growth. And I think 30% growth year after year of M&A activity is healthy for the industry. I'll share a little bit more about that. What do I mean? This industry, Corey, you know better than anyone. I'm a nerd. I'm happy to talk through it. But we are going to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of advisors that are going to be selling over the next several years. We have an industry with 10,000 firms. Only 30% have written succession plans in place. And it's an aging advisor base. I mean, the average owner age is about 62 years old. Cerulli does great work. They talk about the average advisor being, I think it's 53. But when you look at the owners, they're much older. So what do we have? We have this intersection point of lack of succession planning and the fact that folks are methodically moving toward retirement. So what does that mean? When you're only having 100 transactions a year for an industry with 10,000 firms, even 5,000 over 100 million, this is a problem. We should be seeing 300 transactions a year. Matter of fact, each year we don't have 300 transactions. It means we have a growing supply of transactions that's going to need to come onto the market. So, back to Dave being a nerd, when I think, okay, how do we go from here, well below what we should be transacting at, to what eventually is going to have to occur? We have to have a clearing occur where all the supply comes onto the market. I'd rather see a pretty steep 30% year after year growth trajectory of M&A activity than, sort of just going more of a flat line and then a massive spike where ultimately if a huge surge comes, a huge one, it will overwhelm the buying power of buyers. They just won't be able to absorb them all. The complexity of M&A. So, a starting point, I'll pause and see if you have any questions on that before I switch over to COVID, something that's a little newer. But yeah, 2019 in many regards was a healthy thing that I'd love to see repeated in the future.
Yeah. So let me ask, I'm going to challenge you a little bit. I only feel comfortable doing this because I know I'm challenging myself in the same way, because you and I have actually been on stages together, and other things together, going back probably at least 5, actually probably more, 6, 7, 8 years. You and I have both said that the average owner is aging, that there's got to be, there's going to be shift in demographics, that there has to be more deals. And I think everybody in the industry, not to just leave us alone out there, Dave, hanging out, having it not happen as quickly. Like everybody in the industry thought that there'd be more deals sooner, I think. What is finally going to make that happen, right? Because people seem to be hanging on, and we've been tooting this horn for a while now, right?
I think it's sort of a mixed thing. I think part of it is good news. The human body lasts much longer than it used to, right? 65 is a metric that some people have in their head around when advisors should retire. Well, my dad's 82. He beats me almost, every time we play golf, he beats me. Often when we play tennis, he beats me. The human body, the human mind is much different than it was, a couple decades ago. So the good news is we're not wearing out as human beings. The bad news is, as you kick the can further and further down the road, especially when you go to an industry level with thousands and thousands of firms, eventually there could be an inflection point where that deluge occurs. So I think it's interesting too. You can get into psychology. I used to think it was the psychology, this slippery slope from, gee, I need a succession plan. Let me plan to do that, to, wow, succession means change. Change is not good. I don't like change. That also means retirement, more change. And ultimately, that's a slippery slope to death. I don't want to die. I'm not going to put a succession plan in place. So I'm no Freudian expert here, but I think that was part of it. I think the good news yet again is that advisors now are starting to engage with M&A, perhaps not for a retirement play. More often than not, it's a scale play. Folks are realizing that if they're 100 million, life would be easier. If they're part of a $500 million or $1 billion firm, even multi-billion dollar firms are realizing that, hey, there's going to be some mega firms and maybe we want to be part of one of those because the game is going to continue to change. So it's always been a dynamic space. The dynamics just keep changing.
Yeah, totally right. And listen, we've had the whole conversation. We won't spend a lot of time on it here, on the advantages of getting ahead of the game and the way options narrow if you wait too long and all that kind of stuff. That's clearly the case. But yeah, let's jump into COVID. And really, I think you'd probably stutter anyway, but I'd love you to start let's call it immediately pre-COVID, right? Or pre-awareness of COVID, which I sort of look at as March, right? Even though it was around before that. March is when everybody said, oh, what is this thing? And lockdown started to happen or whatever. Right before that, where was the mindset of the industry? Where were deals? Where were valuations? And, that kind of stuff, deal structures. And then, what has happened since?
Yeah, yeah. A roller coaster for sure. So we started this year with a bang. January 2020 was an all-time high of monthly activity. I've been doing this for 17 years, had good data for a couple of years before that. And before that, the industry is just a shadow of what it is today. So, I can say with conviction that January was the most active month we had ever had in this industry. And that was driven by a couple of factors, including what you touched on. Valuations were at an all-time high. Again, I've been tracking this. I went on record probably about a year and a half ago saying, hey, valuations are now officially at an all-time high in the industry. It eclipsed the peak that I didn't think it would eclipse before, which was 2008, early 2008. And it eclipsed it in a good way. In 2008, there were a lot of jokers, a lot of folks that had a bunch of cash in their wallet and they weren't super sophisticated and they were throwing it around. And, a lot of those firms blew up and went away. Today's buyers are sophisticated. They've created models in many cases that can unlock greater profitability and greater growth. And better than anyone, when you have those two elements, you can pay a higher valuation. So we could talk a little bit more about, not everyone can pay the highest valuation, but suffice it to say, valuations were at an all-time high. And then you're spot on, January, some rumblings, February, a little bit more of a fear factor, March hitting in all cylinders. Matter of fact, we actually look at February as when it started impacting this industry. Mm-hmm. We saw the deals drop from that all-time high to less than 50%, starting in February, March again being low. And we went into the second of 4 phases that DeVoe & Co. created. You can see it in our RIA deal books that we come out with once a quarter. We'll have one out in a week. And, 4 phases. The first, once COVID hit, the 4 phases of post-COVID RIA M&A is, phase 1 is just deals that are getting done. It hits. If you're negotiating a deal and you're far along, you're going to land that plane. You're going to get it done. But, part of that started happening in tandem with phase 2, which is this lull of activity. We can talk a little bit about it. There's this divergence that we saw where the lull, it hit everyone initially. They were like, wow, COVID, what's happening here? Let me catch my breath. But firms under $1 billion, firms that were not professionally managed, really slowed down and for a longer period. Firms over $1 billion, sort of dusted themselves off and started doing deals. As a matter of fact, a lot of deals, 50% more deals than average. So, phase 2 was this lull that happened for, frankly, it was only about 4 months. I expected to be 3 or 4 quarters, but it was really about 4 months that the industry had this lull of activity. And we've now solidly moved into phase 3. Phase 3 is a surge of activity. We went on record too about halfway through the quarter saying, hey, heads up, we actually just we're back on track. The lull has passed. We're now at the surge activity. We just eclipsed a record number of transactions that we've seen in a quarter. So I won't say the number, but I'll tell you Q3 2020, despite what I expected, maybe what you expected, which advisors in our poll, we poll advisors, you can find that too, a poll that we did a couple months ago. They expected 2020 to be a soft year, but sure enough, we're back on track. Valuations never pause through this process, Corey. Even in that lull of activity, we have sophisticated buyers that had been through 2008. They were looking at the cash flow and, frankly, Q1 cash flow of 2019 was pretty similar to Q1 cash flow for 2020 for a variety of reasons, but they didn't blink on the valuation. They did blink on deal structure.
Yes.
And deal structures went from, close to 80% down in many cases, down to 50% down. And gee, you know what? We're going to put some barriers in place or some risk mitigation techniques so we're both sort of sharing in the risks. And I'll tell you, the roller coaster is back up. We see the deal structures equally attractive as they were back in, December 2019 and January 2020. So yeah, quite a roller coaster indeed.
It's really interesting, Dave, because obviously, listeners, you got to understand, I have a firm that is a little bit of a microcosm in the industry because we do a lot in this industry, but it's still anecdotal, right? But the interesting thing is our anecdotal experience is exact. Yeah. But Dave is the geek. Affectionately, he calls himself that. He's the guy with the numbers. His deal books are amazing that they put out every quarter. You really get great insight into a lot of things that's going on in the industry that he monitors. So you should check them out. But my anecdotal experience, my little microcosm of the RIA M&A world really tracked that. I mean, we had a couple of deals in progress and they got done, like you said. We had our smaller firms that look at deals who put I have a lot that's come back over the last couple of few months that were, they were in a little wait and see on hold and whatever. None of those deals died. They're all back, either closed or in the process of, of going down the road there. And it is a little shock. I mean, listen, I'm pleasantly surprised. We've had some of our busiest months in business during COVID. after that sort of wait and see hiccup period. So it's a great thing. And maybe, a little surprising, we sort of anticipated the timing to be longer than, as you did as well. So it's a great thing.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking. And, I'm hoping it's a V curve, right? We had that 4-month decline and 2 months if you just look at the $1 billion plus deals. And, the surge is back. 2008, going back in history, we saw a W curve. It was much more drawn out. In 2008, the RIA deals really slowed down for not only several quarters, but even a year or more. Started surging back up. They came back to the tables and then it just collapsed again. So we'll see. I guess, COVID is real. It's going to impact RIAs. We started the conversation with succession planning and the average age. I mean, it can be a little scary. I mean, going into the office now is arguably a life or death decision in some cases. And the good news, the silver lining, is that hopefully more advisors will now fire up, get their succession plans done, do it internally, do it externally, whatever it takes, but mitigate some of the risks that a lot of firms have individually as an exposure point, and clearly this industry has an exposure point. Yeah.
Actually, let's jump into this, because the other thing that, you and I have talked about, in one-on-one conversations and from stages and, the press and, others have talked about, is the challenge of this industry with next gen. And what have you seen in terms of, because it's great to say, hey, we'd love to do an internal succession, but if you don't have the people in place who could really run the firm, and or have the capital. Now, there are many, many more options than when you and I first started talking about this in terms of funding and capital options, whether it's lending or equity, minority equity pieces or whatever, to fund internal succession than they used to be. But what about the real dearth of next gen talent that the industry has done a horrible job over the years? Have you seen any shift in that? Because we've been talking about that for a little while. You see any improvement in the industry on that?
Yeah. I think it's, again, sometimes advisory firms, don't want to take that hard look. And there's two extremes there. One is they don't have the talent in place. Oftentimes there's an intuition there. The other extreme is they've waited too long and the firm is just worth too much. The next gen isn't going to be able to afford it. The mail truck is just too far away from the dog. The dog's not going to catch it. It's moving too quickly. And, I'm from California, so I can talk about Buddhist concepts. There's this Buddhist concept of, this being the case, now what? This being the reality of the situation. Let's not avoid it. Let's deal with it. If we don't have people in house, let's accept that and now move on. If G2 can't afford it, let's deal with that and figure out what the solution set is and engage. So I think advisory firms across the continuum need to focus on G2, and they need to do it for a couple of reasons. Part of that survey that I talked about, I think it's called "The Time Is Now." If I recall correctly, you'd think I'd know this right off the top of my head. I have a wonderful marketing person now that puts names to all these things. But right. We did a survey, and part of that survey, 57%, Corey, 57%, a majority of the firms said that if they had to transfer management and leadership to G2 tomorrow morning, 57% said it would be bumpy at best. Some said much worse than bumpy. Some said a disaster. Some said, we don't even have G2 in place. So only 10% said it'd be as good or even better. So, and I think this is an alarm bell. So even if you have a succession plan in place, even if you've identified those people, this is a people industry, and your ability to coach them more effectively, provide more professional feedback and reviews, to refine the incentive compensation plan, really to migrate responsibilities over to their plate. So it's not a theoretical construct. You're helping them actually learn how to run the firm, how to make these decisions, how accounting works, how to focus on marketing and all these things. Then you're really starting to create an industrial strength organization. So that G2, part of it is solving it so you can sleep a little better at night. And frankly, your clients can sleep better at night because your clients are actually wondering about it. If there's not a clear succession plan, they're starting to wonder, what's the responsibility level of this client? But if you have identified that team, really coaching them to be the very best successors as possible. So there's no better investment you can make.
Let's take a break from the show for a minute so I can invite you to a new way to determine your deal readiness. I created a fast and easy assessment that will determine exactly how deal ready you are. Once you complete the assessment, I use your responses to identify the obstacles that are holding you back from being a deal-driven growth genius. It's as easy as heading to corykupfer.com/assessment. That's corykupfer.com/assessment and filling out a few multiple choice questions. I'll be checking in after the episode to see what your results are. Now back to the show. We mentioned in your bio that, at a high level, you do investment banking, you do consulting, you do valuation work. But I happen to know because, I follow you a bit and so we keep in contact. A lot has happened at DeVoe Company over the last 20 months in terms of additional services that you guys and offerings that you guys have, some key personnel you brought on. Give us an update about, some of the expanded services and team that you have at DeVoe Company.
Yeah. So, we keep chugging along. We started, as you know, almost 9 years ago. It was just me. We'll have our 14th person join in 2 weeks. And we just keep expanding and going deeper on what we're doing. So you might recall 2 years ago, you mentioned capital and passing. DeVoe Capital Works. There's so many different solutions. There's now 30 different options for firms, 30 different providers in the marketplace specifically to RIAs. So we created a methodical approach. It's complimentary. It takes 30 or 45 minutes. We'll ask you 20 or 30 questions to determine, hey, these 3 solutions are good for you, or these 2 are one, and these other 4 or 5, just don't make sense or whatever else. So we'll guide people through that. We created a coaching platform where, coaching your next gen is critical. We do coaching on that front. We also do coaching of principals. We have, 4 people on the team now, that actually a total of 6 people that have run $1 billion plus RIAs. And 4 of them are actively providing coaching services, biweekly calls with RIAs like anyone on the call to help them look around corners and run their business better. We also created a one-to-many coaching platform. We call it an accelerator. We just finished our first one. It was a 6-month program, monthly rhythm we had 9, $1 to $3 billion advisors that are friends of DeVoe Company pilot it. We're now opening it up to a broader group to optimize the value of your firm. So once a month, we get the gang together. It's like a study group on steroids. The next hire is really exciting. I mentioned that survey you've been hearing me talk about human capital, best kept secret. I think we're doing as much or more human capital than anyone else in the industry. And that's a core focus. So we have a full-time managing director that's coming on with great experience that will be starting, maybe even before or after you launch this, but she'll be starting shortly and spend all of her time really focused on helping the advisor community run their businesses better with that critical investment, their human capital. So lots of exciting stuff indeed.
So that's great. There's so many ways that you help advise, and you know this industry so well. So let's get back a little bit. So we talked about, sort of the past 2019. We talked about immediately pre-COVID in 2020. We talked about COVID and coming, I don't want to say out of it in terms of the pandemic, but out of it at least in terms of, how the industry adjusted to it. Let's look forward a little bit. So, we still, valuations have stayed strong, which means that they're at all-time highs. You mentioned some things around deal structure. I mean, I remember a time when you used to regularly say to a client that, it's 25 to 33% down and the rest over whatever, 3 years, 5 years, whatever. Like you said, down payments pushed up, sometimes as high as 80%. Now they've come down more like 50, but it's still above what, sort of in the traditional world, the quarter to a third it used to be. You mentioned some things about risk shifting. I've seen that as well, where there's some, more risk if clients don't stay or come, whatever, look backs, adjustments, earnouts, whatever, in deals. I know none of us have a crystal ball to the future, and a million things can happen in the world that affect the market and all that kind of stuff. But just in terms of trends, what are we seeing? I mean, there's certain things like more, money, private equity, even, firms that are doing minority investments, which never used to be around. The ecosystem keeps growing. On the flip, we have people like Goldman Sachs looking to get into custody and hiring some people out of Schwab and Pershing, recent announcements, right? So, a lot of trends happening there. How do you see all that affecting the future of the industry?
Yeah. I think, it's a dynamic industry. I mean, the starting point and the good news is the industry is the white cowboy hats. These are people taking a fiduciary approach to helping the investing public. So, honored to be part of this community. And literally our mission is, hey, we can't help do the great work that all these RIAs do for the investing public, but we sure can help them run better companies so they can touch more and more people, help them, help more and more Americans invest their money and achieve their goals and their objectives. So, so that foundational thing, I think, is just, it's attracting more and more interest. It's attracting more and more smart people. It's attracting more and more private equity, and it will become, I think, more and more dynamic. We've been in the space for years and even decades, approaching decades. and it's been a dynamic space, but I think it's really going to accelerate. So a few trends that I see happening. One is we'll go through the rest of this lull on the M&A activity. I'm sorry, the surge, phase 3. We'll see additional activity that will spike for a while. I could see that sustained for several quarters. And eventually we'll move back to that upward trajectory that I hope to see around 30% or more a year, consistently year after year. I'm very sensitive to, and the reason I track M&A in such a disciplined format or approach is because I am worried about it becoming unhealthy, where we have too many sellers and not enough buyers, and that's just going to create some disasters for the industry. So I think on the M&A front, that's going to happen. I think the other thing that's related but separate from that is we're going to see the emergence of these mega firms. These aren't just big firms, biggest part of it, but these are sophisticated management teams that are intelligently running organizations. They often have private equity backing or at least capital to do things really creatively. So just because you're big doesn't mean you're what I'm categorizing as a game-changing mega firm. It's because you're big and you're doing things differently. And I think we will see a diversion here. We will see these mega firms that will separate from the pack. They're going to grow faster. They're going to do things differently. They're going to offer, I'll say it, they're going to offer greater value to the clients. It's a trend that's emerging. Now, the good news is that doesn't mean that everyone should pack it up and go away. That doesn't mean we're going to see massive consolidation, from 10,000 firms in the industry down to, 2,000 or 5,000 or even 8,000. There's very low barriers to entry. And once you're in this business, wearing that fiduciary hat with this strong attention to detail, the nature of the beast in this industry, advisors are taking care of clients well, and the small, medium, and large will continue to exist. So I don't think there's an existential threat. This isn't, hey, you got to get big or go home. It's not going to be the travel industry when the .com hit, but we are going to see this divergence, and some of these mega firms are just going to do things differently. I think, we're also going to see, related to that, but separate, is technology is going to shift from being an enabler to make things more efficient, to take headaches off people's plates, give them more time, make them more industrial strength, give them almost synthetic scale to a degree. We're going to start seeing technology, drive growth directly. Some of these mega firms are going to start, thinking very creatively. And matter of fact, we have you mentioned the M&A Plus Summit that's coming up, and please attend again and report away. I guess this time it'll be remotely. But one of the speakers I just got off the call this morning, they're going to be talking about how they are using technology almost with a Cambridge Analytics, sort of a mega data approach to applying technology and intelligence to every stage of the funnel for a sales cycle, all the way through close, And by the way, COVID has only accelerated this. It's just changed. You can imagine people using Zoom and things like that. It's just changed the event. So yeah, long story short, a lot of dynamic activities that are going to be occurring to the space. So it's a fun time to be part of this industry.
I agree with that, by the way. I think just the trends are, just so continue to be in favor of independence, right? And the level of sophisticated teams that are moving out and the infrastructure and support around them in terms of technology and financing and consulting and, you name it, is amazing. And it's just, it's just really a maturing industry. Let's go to the other extreme. And I don't think we're near that yet, but you look at, all right, there is a fundamental difference. These mega firms are still going to be fiduciaries, which is very different than being a brokerage firm where you don't have a fiduciary obligation. But inherently, as scale comes in, a lot of people criticize, for example, the wirehouses for all of the, the advisors leave because they're frustrated by compliance and all the systems they got to deal with, and they got to get everything approved and, and all that stuff. And, we always talk about the fact that a lot of compliance isn't true compliance. If you look at true compliance as what is allowed by law or not, most of what compliance does in these big firms is risk management, right? And they say, hey, if we're really big, we're going to restrict people from doing this, making these kind of decisions, not because it's illegal, but because it exposes us to risk, and we can't manage that when we have thousands of advisors. So what do you think the risk is of these mega firms over time, creating environments, and again, there's a difference between a fiduciary, but still creating environments that start to feel more restrictive or more, cookie cutter, or more, like the things that independent advisors have left. I'm just curious as to your thought on that. And, that's part of the way probably the smaller and medium sized are going to continue to compete, to say, hey, you're going to have more say, more discretion, less rules involved. So, I'm curious as to your view on that.
Yeah. There's a certain amount of freedom that advisors, breakaway brokers, whatever we want to call it, feel when they jump ship. A matter of fact, in many cases, it's the impetus for them to leave. I think you said it well. There's depending on how you define compliance, that can run the continuum of leader, good stewardship, even marketing. And, you're at a wirehouse and reporters call and you can't talk to them. You have really important things to say. But much more importantly, within the constructs of the SEC, it gives a lot of freedom to do what's best for the client. So, clearly compliance, not our bailiwick, not what we focus on day to day. Legal, I always defer to experts like you. That's a lot of complexity there. Last thing you want to do is, color outside the lines. That's why folks like you exist to help guide people to the right decisions. But just a completely different world. And literally why, folks like you and I use the construct of white cowboy hat is within those constraints and guardrails. There's so much good that can be done for the investing public.
Yeah, no question about it. So yeah, I agree. I think that's why the mega firms will never have all the issues, never be the White House, but there is something about scale that does change, things. And, and listen, I've always said there's room for all the models, not only independent space, but frankly, there's room in the, for the IBDs and the wirehouses, although you and I tend to be evangelists for independence. There are also just certain folks, who should never be entrepreneurs. And I don't mean that as a diss in any way. I just mean.
Yeah, the lines are gray. They get grayer each year. Yep, you're spot on. Yeah.
All right. Before we conclude here, Dave, any last minute thoughts, tips, things that we haven't covered that you want to, make people aware of in terms of what's going on in the industry or anything about what you're up to?
No, I'll tell you, you're a crackerjack. It's such a pleasure to talk to you when you hit all the headlines and the highlights. I'll just nothing to add. I think it was a lot of fun. It's great. And again, Corey, I mean, it's so great to see people that you like and admire do great things. And honored to be, the first time dual headliner. I think Steve Martin and a couple folks have a certain jacket that I think they get at Saturday Night Live after they've been on a couple times. So good to be part of the gang there of these future multiple interviewees. Yeah. Thanks again for having me. And thanks for doing all the great work you do.
Appreciate that. So I do have a closing question, but before I do that, what's the best place for people to find out more about you and DeVoe Company?
Yeah, indeed. www.devoeandcompany.com. So in life, we're DeVoe ampersand and co. Online, it's just DeVoe, DEVOE and company.com.
Great. So Dave, so listeners who've been listeners for a while will know that, when it was Fueling Deals, my final question was about one of my highest values, authenticity. And you can go back to episode 1 and hear Dave's answer to that one. But since we've rebranded as DealQuest over the last, 40 episodes, 50, whatever it's been, my final question is actually about my highest ideal, which is freedom. And for me, I wear this little myintent.org bracelet that says freedom on it. It's actually the only piece of jewelry I wear. And for me, freedom, has to do with everything like bigger issues like freedom from oppression from all people, but it also, has to do with why I'm an entrepreneur and why I love working with, breakaway brokers and advisors and other entrepreneurs in other industries who, build and create things. Dave, what does freedom mean to you and how does it impact your life and business?
I love these questions you end with. They're so great. I'll actually even connect the two to be authentic about it. I'd love to say something really inspirational, but when you mention freedom and I think about it, I think back to the day I left Schwab, great organization, to launch DeVoe Company, et cetera. A day or two later, I got on a plane. I went down to Mexico for a wedding and I met this guy in the van. They had a van going to the destination, et cetera. I'm launching my company, I'm going live. And he was already an entrepreneur. And he said, it was very profound. He said, yeah, you're giving up the illusion of security for the illusion of freedom. And I thought, what are you talking about? I'm running my own company. I'm calling all the shots, et cetera, et cetera. And if you think about it, in these large companies, do you have massive security? No, not really. Anything could change on any given day. And Corey, to be authentic, right now, I am struggling with freedom. I just got back. I spent a week in Miami and, I intended to spend some time vacationing and having fun. And throughout the day, I just continue to crank away. I crank nonstop. Yep. I'm having a blast what I'm doing, but I've also, that blast ends up having me committing to do so many things that I sometimes find myself fighting for freedom. So in the next episode, maybe you can share how I can have greater freedom within this entrepreneurial mindset that I've created.
No, Dave, I think I appreciate that authentic answer. And it's something that we all deal with. And, It's great. Yeah, we don't have a boss, right, as entrepreneurs, except for all our clients. And if we're doing it right, frankly, all our employees, not that they're really our boss, but we need to, we're a resource to them if we're setting it up right. So they need us, our clients need us. So yeah, I love that comment about it being somewhat of an illusion of freedom. I do think that ultimately we do have the ultimate decision-making authority. And I think that does give us a freedom, but figuring out how that, really applies and how we have day-to-day freedom is a classic entrepreneurial challenge.
Yeah.
Love it. Dave DeVoe, thank you so much for coming back and being a guest on the DealQuest podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of DealQuest, where we help you understand how deal-driven growth can be your ticket to freedom. I want to invite you to a unique way to tap into the wisdom and experience of the DealQuest community. Join the DealQuest Deal Den Zoom calls, a free monthly 90-minute mastermind. In the mastermind, we address all the challenges you may be facing and help support you with the opportunities that may arise in terms of deal-driven growth. You will get input not only from me, but all the members on the call will collaborate and serve each other in a mastermind format. To sign up for the free mastermind, go to www.corykupfer.com/dealden. That's corykupfer.com/dealden. I'll see you there. I'm Corey Kupfer. Until next week, wishing you the freedom and financial prosperity that I know your DealQuest will bring.